Okay, well, welcome everybody. Just wanted to welcome you to the Iris webinar that we're holding this afternoon. This is the first webinar that is focused more on professional development for early career people. So this will be the first of a hopefully long-running series that we're organizing here at Iris. So just to introduce to you guys, I'm Andy Frisetto. I am a project associate at Iris at the headquarters office in DC. And so I'm helping coordinate a lot of our early career initiatives. So if you haven't been in one of these webinars before, the way it works is I'll turn it over to David, who will give a 40 to 50-minute talk, sort of standard colloquium length talk. And then we'll have the opportunity to have questions afterwards. The way we handle the questions typically is not to unmute everybody's audio because it would be a little chaotic. So what we do is we have a window where you can type in questions. So if you're interested in asking the speaker something, either during the talk, I think David might prompt some conversation, or even afterwards, please definitely use that option because in the previous webinars, we've had some great exchanges and some great questions from the audience. And so just because you're sitting through a computer terminal doesn't mean we still can't have a good dialogue out of this. So I would certainly encourage people to do that. And also, I wanted to let everybody know that this is being recorded as we speak and will be archived and posted on the Iris ENO YouTube channel, as well as the Iris ECI and webinar web pages. And so the URL for those would be www.iris.edu/HQ/ECI. And maybe at the end of the talk, I'll pop up that web page just so you can see where to look. And so I think without further ado, I'll introduce to you all our speaker today, David McConnell. David's a professor at NC State University, and he'll be talking to us about getting ready for class, preparing to teach to maximize learning. Okay, David.
Thanks, Andy. So I'm a professor of geoscience education here in the Marine Earth and Atmospheric Science Department, and myself and my grad students work on basically how to promote learning in a variety of classes and how to help faculty at a research institution like this adapt their classes in a way that will help promote that learning. And this is a professional development opportunity, this event that you're participating in now, but many faculty don't have time to attend these kinds of things, or if they do, they don't have time to put things into practice because it takes a lot of planning and thought. So as we go through these things, I recognize that essentially what we're trying to do here is kind of catalyze some ideas that you can maybe adapt and pick and choose which things best work for you. But before you kind of jump in and try a bunch of things based on kind of a gut feel for it, which is pretty much what I did for the first 10 years of my career, we want to give you some insights as to what some of the more effective strategies are to kind of set up your course and to scaffold learning, to encourage students to learn. And so we're going to do this around a relatively simple format by planning about what exactly your learning goals are, thinking about how to assess those learning goals, and then moving on to some way then to teach to get at those assessments. So the goals for this session for me, much like they would be for any lecture as I go into it, I'm thinking about, well, what do I want people to get out of this? So when I'm teaching, I taught yesterday afternoon, when I taught, I had 3 or 4 learning goals I put up on the first slide for my students. And I said, these are the things that I want you to learn as a result of this lecture. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to set these up and how to write effective learning goals very early on here. So I want you to think about writing effective learning goals and feeling comfortable about doing that before you, when you leave here today. And we're going to practice a little bit of that. I want you to think about what a formative or summative assessment is and how it could be tied into that learning goal. I want you to think about what kind of in-class activities that you could use in order to address these concepts. And that's, when I talk about in-class activities, it's essentially anything other than lecturing. And then at the end of the day, I hope you can take something away from this where you have a template of essentially a series of strategies where you're going to have like a three-step process essentially in designing any lesson that you're going to give. And so before you reach for the textbook or the slides that come with it, you think, okay, what is it I want students to learn? How will I know if they've learned that? And then how am I going to go about teaching till they get to that point? So without any further ado, I thought we'd just start off with getting a little bit of reflection of what is it the students say about learning. And so these comments come from a book written by Seymour and Hewitt back in 1997. It's called Talking About Leaving, Why Students Leave the Sciences. And so they went around and they interviewed, these two researchers went around and interviewed a bunch of students in STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and math, at a variety of universities. And some of those students had left the STEM disciplines, and some of them had stayed in. And essentially they asked them about their experience and why they stayed, why they left. And a lot of it came down to the principal reason why most people leave is because they lose interest. It's not that they can't handle the work, it's just they become disinterested in the way the classes are being taught, and they don't engage them. And so they find other things that are more interesting, and they go off and do that. 80 something percent of all the students who they interviewed complained about the way the classes were taught. And so these kind of comments that you see here essentially point out that the connection between the instructor and the student is often a big disconnect there. That the students don't really get what the instructors are trying to do, or the instructors don't really get where the students are as far as their learning goes. And so it's almost like they're speaking different languages. And so one of the things we're trying to do here today is kind of align those languages up so that we both are talking about the same thing. So if I say, this is what I want you to learn, the students understand explicitly what that means, and then can go about trying to figure that out. And I will put in measures along the way to see if they are getting close to the goals that I've set for them. And so this is the kind of thing I want to kind of try to set up for us today. And I'm going to do it through this process of backward course design, and that is, we're going to start not with the content. We're going to start with the big idea, that is, what are the learning goals for us? And depending on how one defines this, that might be something that's true for a whole course, but I'd like to look at it on the basis of simply a lesson. If you have a 50-minute class, or maybe you have a lab or a seminar, and you want to have a one-off experience in doing something, much like me today trying to talk to you for these 50 minutes, what is the learning goal? What is it I want these students to know and be able to do when they leave that room that day? And that's my first step. So identifying effective learning goals. And the second thing I want to get to is then, okay, if I say that's where I want them to be, I want to think about, okay, so how will I know that they're there? It's one thing for me to talk about it. That's the teaching part, but I'm really more interested in the learning part. These are learning goals. These are not teaching goals. Teaching goals are easy to write because that's just what I'm going to do. But the whole point of education is to get the students to learn it. And so I need to find some way to measure if that learning is happening. And that's where the feedback and assessment comes in. So we're going to set our learning goals. We're going to think about what our feedback and assessment might look like to assess those learning goals. And then we're going to then design the course to get to that point where we can introduce those feedback and assessment methods. And those are the teaching and learning activities we're going to talk about. So that's the step. I'm going to go in. I'm going to start with 1, I'm going to go to 2, and I'm going to 3. But before we go to any of that, I want you to look down at the yellow bar, the situational factors, the things that are going to affect how the class is taught. And these are going to be different for every person in different places, depending on a variety of factors. These are things that are going to influence the learning experience beyond simply the content, beyond you and the way that you like to teach. And so this whole design, this idea of backward course design isn't something that's new here, but this particular little sequence of it and combination of things is taken from a book by D. Fink. And so the reference is down there at the bottom. So I'll reference this chart. We'll come back to it several times during the talk. And so this little 3-step process, I think, is very effective for helping us get there. But before we get there, I want you to think a little bit about what are the situational factors that could impact the learning experience in the classroom for your students. So where the challenges in a course or the content that have to be taken into account when you're designing the course of the lesson. So one thing, a lot of times people will say to me when we ask this question, say, well, student learning styles are something that's going to influence it. Some students are more likely to learn based on images, diagrams, figures. Others are more find it easier to learn based on just reading and the written word. And so we have these two different kind of poles in student learning. We have some who like to get lots of examples, and others who like to be more abstract. So the concrete versus the abstract is another way of doing it. There's lots of just student learning styles. So student learning styles might be one thing we think about when we're thinking about situational factors. But there's a variety of other things as well. So think about the classes that you teach. So I'm going to give you a moment here to give me a few responses, or maybe to give Andy a few responses, and then he can summarize them for us. So what are some of the things that impact the teaching/learning process that's going on in your classroom that might affect how students go about learning, that you have to take into account when you're designing a course or a lesson? So we're going to take about 30 seconds to a minute now to think about this, and if you would just type a few words or a phrase into the little chat box, and hopefully someone there is observing it and will be able to report out what some of your answers are. Okay, so let's do this. Let's take about 30 seconds and go from there. Okay, so I had a little time there. Is there
There's
any?
a good number of responses.
Okay, so
Do
what
you
kind of
want me
things have you
just to
got?
go through these all at once, or you want to address them
Yeah, just
point by point?
just give me just read out several in a row.
There's student attitudes. This is a course they are forced to take and generally do not want to.
Mm-hmm.
Solving problems quantitatively, abstractness of concepts that are being
Mm-hmm.
presented, background knowledge (parentheses math). Level of students, content of material is defined by textbook and course outline. Distracting factors such as mobile phones, teacher-student interaction, varied student backgrounds, prior knowledge and experience.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's a pretty good sample. I mean, that's a lot of the things that I might expect to hear. In fact, if I show you the list that I came up with on my own ahead of time, a lot of the things you were talking about are on here. I might also say we didn't hear class size in that group, which is always a big factor. You know, if you have 200 students, you teach them quite differently, or you might have different challenges than if you have 10. Um, we're seeing more and more online classes now. The difference between lecture and lab, the kind of space you work in, all of these things are factors that we have to take into account. But to a large degree, these are factors we can't do a whole lot about. I mean, we're in certain institutions and we're teaching in certain rooms, and the classes are kind of predefined to a large degree. Occasionally, we get to design our own and set the parameters for that. But for the most part, these situational factors are just going to be what they are, and we have to deal with them. But in that context, we can then have to move forward and figure out, okay, how am I going to teach this class? So you can focus on that stuff, and you can complain about the majors and the quality of the students and the size of the class and all these other things. But at the end of the day, that's not, you're not really going to get anywhere with that. So unless you have the power to change all those things, which is relatively unlikely, it's better to focus on then, given those constraints, how then do I set up my class? And what kinds of things can I do? And this is going to constrain to some degree the kind of some of the assessments you do, some of the activities that you might do in class. But at the end of the day, you know, there are ways to make adjustments for those things, and people can teach big classes just as effectively as they can teach small classes. There might be more of a challenge, there might be some more managerial issues, but there's no reason why a big class can't be just as rewarding as a smaller one, and vice versa for those of you who have more of a performance bent. So let's start out with the learning goals and figure out what those might be. And these are going to be different depending on what kind of institution you are, what kind of class you're teaching, and some of those situational factors that you have. But we can design, if we design effective learning goals, then it's a lot easier to kind of do everything else and tie everything else into those. So I'm going to talk about teaching and learning goals here. So the contrast is what we're trying to do is not focus on what the teacher is doing, but instead focus on what the students are doing, what they're getting out of this. So I'm going to have a few slides here to talk about this idea of learning goals, and others might call these learning objectives. Still others might call them learning outcomes. I'm not going to get too worried about the semantics of these terms at this point. I just want to get the idea out there that we should make it clear to our students what it is we want them to learn. And the clearer we can make that, the easier it's going to be for them then to act on those things. So the goals should focus on the work of the students, not the teacher. So if you look at descriptions, they tend to be, of most courses, they tend to be relatively generic, and there's a sentence or two, and that's about it. They describe the character of the course. There's not much room to talk about what students are going to know or be able to do. So a lot of times when we define our courses, we tend to write them in kind of very teacher-centered language. And so we need to be thinking more along the lines of what a student would like versus what a student-focused goal looks like versus a teacher-focused goal. So rather than providing students with information on rocks, we want the students to use that information to be able to do something and be able to do something with it. So what exactly that appropriate goal would be, that's something that you can identify for yourselves. So goals should focus on the work of the students. And one good way to think about this is to use the phrase "students will be able to" as your starter. So if you think about the next lecture you're going to do, or maybe the last lecture you just finished, if you think back on that material and you think about, well, if I had to kind of pick 3 or 4 things that after that lecture I would want my students to be able to do that they were unable to do before the lecture started, what would those kinds of things be? So some of the kinds of things that you might choose depending on what type of course you're teaching. And I apologize for these all being very geological as opposed to geophysical, but there you go. That's who you've got talking to you today. So students will be able to list the periods of the geologic timescale. So that's a very low-level thing you're asking them to do. That's not very complicated. It's basically just memorizing things in the correct order. At the same time, there's obviously some framework knowledge that the students are going to need to be able to do anything. So there's no harm in having them do some basic things just to make sure they know the vocabulary. So you might want them to be a little more analytical. So students will be able to recognize erosional and depositional glacial landforms on a topographic map. So they have to recognize what those patterns might be and then make some interpretations based on that. So look at the terms they're using here. The students will be able to list and recognize and explain and interpret. These are all things that require them to do something. So some of these might be quite grand, and for example, students will be able to interpret unfamiliar geologic maps and construct cross sections. That's the kind of goal that it might take several lectures to do. It might take a whole course to do it in some cases. Depends on the material you're trying to cover. Some of these things, like knowing the periods of geologic timescale, could quite easily fit into a single lecture. So depending upon what your goal is and the context of the course or the lesson or whatever it is, it's going to vary. But starting out your statement, the students will be able to, essentially forces you to think in terms of the student as opposed to simply say, I want them to learn about X. There should be something that helps you make it clear that they have learned something. Students will be able to understand something is usually a poor choice of words, because understand could mean a lot of different things. There's no way for us to know if they understand it unless we can burrow deep inside their brains and somehow test that information and figure out, get into some neuroscience. But you want something that's going to be more readily demonstrated. So instead of saying that you want them to understand plate tectonics, asking them to interpret an unfamiliar plate tectonic setting based on information on landform seismicity and volcanic activity. So if you gave them this information and they were able to say, oh, that's a convergent plate boundary, and that plate is descending at a certain angle, and we'd expect those volcanoes to have a certain type of magma produced, then you'd feel some confidence that the students could understood the process of plate tectonics and the dynamic nature of plate tectonics, as opposed to simply thinking plate tectonics was the name of 8 different plates and they were able to locate them accurately on a map. And this gets back to this whole idea that it's much easier to assess their learning if you include some kind of action term that will require them to do something. And so it might be writing out a list, it might be applying some kind of equation to answer a problem, might be simply writing something out, so they're explaining something, might be a drawing, labeling something, summarizing a concept, anything like that. That these are all things that can be done. Some can be more challenging than others, depends on how you set it up. But they're all things that you can ask students to do, and then you can see the product they create and then decide, does that meet the standard? The bigger the goal, the kind of more the higher order thinking that you can require them to do. So a lot of these things that we might emphasize are kind of lesson level goals. It might be something in a given lecture. You might want to set your goals relatively modest because you've only got 50 minutes, let's say, or 75 minutes, and you've got to decide how much information they can take in that time. And if you have 3 or 4 goals, essentially what you're saying is a goal for every 15 minutes of lecture. What would that look like if you were going to do it that way? So these tend to be relatively modest. But if you're saying your course goals, they can be grander, and they can be things that you can return to multiple times over the course of a semester. And so if you're teaching a course in geologic hazards, you might want to have something that's going to require students to assess some unfamiliar area and identify the risk from a variety of different hazards. And so this is more of an evaluation process. It requires some synthesis of a lot of different information, some analysis of maybe maps or outcrop data to resolve a problem. And these types of questions, these bigger, higher order tasks typically don't have a single answer in the sense that, the result is landslide. The result is, there are a variety of potential hazards, and of those hazards, here are the ones I think are the most significant, and here are the reasons why I think that is. But in these cases, there may be other answers that people may give. They may choose different hazards. They may have different explanations for why certain hazards are more or less significant. And so these kind of bigger goals that might be course level goals can be a little more challenging and require them to do some higher order tasks, higher order skills, and exhibit those things like synthesis, analysis, and evaluation, as opposed to simply explanation or comprehension. There's a lot more on goals and how to write good goals on the CERC site, the Science Education Resource Center at Carleton College. And there's a whole workshop that's been done in course design, and there's information there on how to set goals. So that link is included here. And so Barb Tewksbury has done some really nice work as far as how to write good learning goals. And if you really want to get into that, there's lots of other things you can find online that help describe that. But starting out with learning goals at the beginning of each class and being explicit about what those are helps guide students along when they're trying to figure out, am I getting what they want out of this? Because a big challenge for them is when they're getting ready for an exam, it's, well, what am I supposed to study? Well, if you've already given them 3 or 4 learning goals for every lecture, then you say, well, there's a study guide right there. You don't have to write one for them. You just say the learning goals are your study guide. Put them all together in a list. If you can respond positively to those learning goals, then you're ready for the exam. And off you go. And so that's step 1, creating the learning goals. So if that's all you're going to do, then at least you've given them a guide, some guidelines as far as where you're going with things. So before we go any further, I'd like you to just kind of apply this now. I'd like you to think about a class. Maybe it's a class you're in. Maybe it's a class you're teaching. Maybe it's a class that you've taken in the past or you've taught in the past. Think of something that you're relatively familiar with, a course you're relatively familiar with. And think if you had to pick out one lecture or lesson from that course, think of one learning goal that you might write for that particular lesson. So I want you to take a few moments now to apply this, to think about writing a learning goal that begins with, students will be able to, and then write a sentence just summarizing whatever a particular learning goal might be. Make sure it's student-focused. Make sure you have a way to demonstrate learning, and the goal is clear. Think about those action terms. Try to include something in there. Describe, sketch, explain, whatever you feel is appropriate for the particular task. So why don't we take a minute now, and I'm going to pause, and I'm going to let you take a little time and just take a piece of scratch paper and write out a sample learning goal for something that's a class that you're thinking about. Okay, so let's take a minute and do that now.
Hey David, do you want people to share these in the chat window?
If a couple of people have some that they feel or that they'd like to share, I'd welcome them to do so. But this may take a little while to sort them out. But if a few are submitted there, that I'd love to hear what they are.
Okay, we'll do.
Okay, how are we doing here? It's kind of hard to do these on demand just on the spur of the moment like this. It's almost better to have some slides in front of you, or at least some notes that come from a lecture.
We have a few entries for this, so I'll just
Okay,
read those off. There's one. Students will be able to distinguish between convergent and divergent plate boundaries. Uh, explain
excellent.
what explain what types of earthquakes occur in a particular tectonic setting.
Hmm. Good.
Explain the difference between earthquake magnitude and intensity.
Oh, that's a good one.
Explain why there are no earthquakes in Illinois for electron volcanoes.
Okay.
And demonstrate how GPS and seismic observations support our understanding of episodic tremor and slip.
Okay. So the nice thing about a lot of those is that you could clearly see that if a student, you could ask that question to a student on an exam or the homework, and you get a written response, and you could tell pretty clearly if they got it or not. So those were lots of good action-oriented tasks there that required everything from relatively basic information to a more thorough analysis and comparison of the two different types of scales, for example. That might seem like a simple question on the outset, but you're looking for multiple examples on each side of that. So it's really a good analysis skill, comparing, contrasting. All right, so you got some learning goals. Now what do? You've written these up, you put them up there at the beginning of class. Students are looking at you and going, okay, so what's this? All right, learning goals, great. Can I ignore those? Do I have to do something with them? So if you just put them up there at the beginning of class and you never say anything more about them, then they will just forget about them. They'll go into the wallpaper of the room and they won't think too much about it. So what you need to do is come back to those things at regular intervals and identify as you go through class. Essentially, think of them as the signposts for the lecture. So you start off on the first one you might get to after 15 minutes. And so you want to think to yourself, okay, so what am I going to do in class to assess if they know that? And I want to get feedback from them so I know that they're learning it here, not 2 weeks from now when they're getting ready for the exam and it's too late for them and they're going back over an idea that they heard after multiple other lectures and other life experiences. It's difficult to kind of piece all that information back together again. What you need to do now is get it from that short-term memory that they're processing it in right there in front of you and into their long-term memory where it's easier to retrieve it from later on. If you wait on it and they don't process it now, then they're trying to do that much, much later when they're trying to shove a lot more information all in there as they cramp with the exam. So what can you do in class to get them to think about this stuff now so it's easier for them to retrieve it later? That's the second part. And that's where we get on to feedback and assessment. So I'd like you to read this and then see how you think if you could answer these three questions that follow. So go ahead. I'll give you a minute again. Read and think of answers. Please don't type the answers in. Just think of, could I answer those questions? Okay, now I would hazard a guess. If I ask you to answer these three questions, that all of you could sit there and write out an effective answer. The information's right there in the text. However, I would also guess that you really didn't learn anything with this. It's all kind of very jargony, and if I called you up in a couple of hours and asked you the answers again, you would probably have no idea because it just all seems like such gibberish, which of course is what it is. So the situation is it's very easy to kind of lose yourself in jargon and lose yourself in technical language, which students really won't appreciate. To them, it'll seem like a foreign language. But at the same time, it's easy to kind of write questions where they can respond in a way that it would look like they know it. But they haven't really learned anything. All they're kind of doing is kind of looking for a very specific answer to a very specific question. It doesn't really help them gain any great conceptual understanding of what's going on. So when you're thinking about how to assess something, don't do this. Don't get lost in the jargon and just ask students basically to repeat back to you what you said to them. That doesn't help. That's not the way people learn. We learn by putting things into our own schema, coming up with our own ways of doing things, our own kind of conceptual schemes for how we think about things, using our own analogies and building our own knowledge. So what we need to do is give students time to play with these ideas so that they can come up with a more effective long-term strategy for remembering this stuff. So what we want to do is focus on assessment that doesn't look like the tri-saline example. So activities that are undertaken to provide information to be used as feedback to modify teaching and learning. So in the short term, we're interested in kind of a short-term assessment and a longer-term assessment. The short-term assessment is what we think of as formative assessment, which is an educational term, which they mean it's assessment that's designed to figure out what's happening right now. So as I am teaching, am I getting this point across effectively? And if I'm not, how can I reorganize my lecture to make that happen? So if I had asked you to give me examples of some of those learning goals and you'd come up with a bunch of nonsense that didn't make any sense, then I would be sitting here worried that I was completely off base and had told you a bunch of stuff that really wasn't very helpful. And I would have to think about how to reorganize that lecture. But you came up with good answers, so my formative assessment is that you got the idea of what a learning goal is. You're thinking about how to write one. That's being done effectively. So we got some short-term formative assessment. But there was no penalty if you got it right or get it wrong. It was mostly just you assessing your learning as you went along. Summative assessment, maybe it's one of these deals where at the end of the workshop, we might give you a test and ask you to define these terms again, or to write learning objectives for a very specific course. Don't freak out. We're not going to do it. It's okay. But in our classes, we do this all the time. We give students information with the goal that when you do my exam, you're going to be asked to give me this information back, perhaps in another form, perhaps exactly in this form. But typically, you're going to have to answer some questions 2, 3, 4 weeks out. And if students don't have a chance to play with that information ahead of time, it's difficult for them then on the day to understand exactly what it is you want to do because they haven't had a chance to practice. So even the most talented people, whether they're scientists, or more specifically, if we think about people in sports or musicians, even the most talented sportsmen and musicians practice all the time. If they didn't practice, they would get rusty, they wouldn't be as good at things, and they would quickly lose their skills. It's the same thing for our students. We can't expect students not to practice for 4 weeks and then suddenly execute things perfectly. We need to give them opportunities for practice. And opportunities for practice where there is no harm. We don't want those conditions to be punitive. We don't want them to be in class responding to a question that gets thrown at them by an instructor and they get it wrong, and then it's, oh, I can't believe you didn't get that right. And it has to be a positive experience where it's okay to get things wrong in class. It's a formative assessment. The formative assessment is kind of a low stakes situation where they get to practice. Now, for many of us who teach small classes with relatively few students, we have a lot of opportunity to interact with those students. And it's relatively simple to tell what they're getting, what they're not getting, how fast different students are moving along, and how well they're understanding something you're trying to teach them, because you're getting constant interaction with them one-on-one in seminars and things like that. In those small class settings, it's very straightforward to assess their learning and their knowledge. As class size grows, as the conditions in the class change, it becomes more challenging. If you've got a class that's, let's say, moderate size, let's say 40, you can't talk to every student in the class every day. That's just impossible. You're trying to get information across. At best, you're using a few proxies in the class to give you answers to questions. And of course, this typically means you're getting the brightest uh, and the students who are most willing to give you answers. And they're speaking up. And so maybe they're representative of the class as a whole. But maybe they're just an isolated subset of the class that are doing particularly well. And so it's difficult to tell what's going on. And so we only really know when we give them some kind of short answer questions when everybody has to write out a response to something. And that, of course, is really only going to occur in exam times. And so there's little gaps starting to show up between our assessment of what they know and when we know what they know. And the bigger the class is, the harder that is. First of all, you have less interaction with every student in the class. And you're often constrained to multiple choice exams because you've got 200 students, for example. So you're not going to, it's impossible to grade that many essays. And so at best, all you can really tell is that students did particularly well on one question or not so well on other questions. And as a whole, the class did well on this topic and not so well on that topic. But it's difficult then to get a sense of where people are. The feedback is, again, on a exam to exam kind of basis. And you're getting you have a very rough instrument to use to figure out exactly what's happening. It'd be much better if we could be more fine-grained about it. If we could identify specific concepts and topics that students are struggling with while they're in class. So this feedback that we get from exams becomes more and more challenging. The bigger the class is, the ways we have of assessing it becomes, the way we have assessing student learning becomes more and more challenging. Less time for each instructor to focus on what the students are learning. So what we want is some way to get around that. And so emphasizing formative assessment or practice learning in class helps promote that idea. It also breaks the class up. It makes it more engaging. It gives students an opportunity to interact with one another and for the group, the class as a whole, to interact with you. It's a much more engaged classroom than one in which somebody is just standing in front of the room and presenting information. There are certainly places for that, but this gives you a much better sense of what students are learning as the information is being presented. Typically, the ideal situation for a formative assessment is some relatively low stakes or no stakes opportunity where you're asking questions and there's no harm in students getting it wrong. And essentially, if you just emphasize to them, look, this is us practicing for when you get the exam. We want you to do well now, or we want you to make mistakes now so you don't make those mistakes later on the exam. And so when it's clear to them that their responses won't draw criticism and they won't result in negative grades, then the class tends to be more open about that interaction and in giving feedback on where they are. So some simple things to do are think, pair, share exercises where you just say, okay, I'm going to ask a question and want you to think about it for 30 seconds. And then I want you to turn to your neighbor, that's the pair part, and share what you've got and compare your answers and see if you can make each other's answers a little bit better. And then you, as an instructor, you might then use that opportunity to say, okay, now let's have a few volunteers suggest responses. This also allows you to get away from that situation where one or two students are dominating the class by answering all the questions, because now you're giving everybody a chance to think about the answer in a sufficient time frame where people can actually process all their ideas, get some validation from a neighbor, get a little more confidence in their interpretation. And then when you ask the class for responses, you're more likely to get a broader cross-section of students giving you an answer. Nowadays, a lot of universities, a lot of departments, a lot of instructors use clickers, these kind of remote control like devices that they can click in answers and respond to multiple choice questions posted on the screen. So we use these quite frequently in our classes. And every time we put them up, we ask the students to turn and talk to those around them and see if they can come to an agreement on the potential answer to the question. And then the vote shows up on the screen as a histogram, and they can see what proportion of the class picked each answer. And the most interesting times, the most richest conversations are often when multiple groups or multiple answers get approximately the same response. So about a third of the class picks A, a third of the class picks B, a third of the class picks C. and then you get a rich discussion about, well, why is this answer better than that answer? It also helps you as an instructor identify where they're having trouble, where they're getting hung up. These are both things that can be done in class without a whole lot of fuss. Even if you don't have clickers, it still can be done with, we started doing it with just lettered cards that people would hold up in front of their chest in their answers, so nobody else could see what their answer was, and you can quickly scan the room and see what the choices are. Other alternatives are students fill out worksheets. Lecture tutorials are the term that are used sometimes for these things, where there's a series of questions with space for the students to fill in the answers. They turn those in at the end of class to get graded, or they get just simply assessed to see how accurate they are. And then the minute papers. The minute papers is a very simple little exercise, and that's take 1 minute at the end of class, and you might ask them simply to say, what's the most important thing we talked about today in class? Or you might turn it around and say, what's the most challenging thing we talked about today in class? Or what are you not clear on as you leave the room? Those are sometimes called muddiest point exercises. These are typically done anonymously, so you get a very quick look. You can scan through the answers very rapidly after class and figure out if the main idea you were trying to get across was the actual idea they're walking out the door with. A very simple opportunity for an exercise is a retrieval exercise, and this is just, and this couldn't be simpler. And it's a simple matter of, after about 20 minutes of class, you might just stop and say, okay, I'm going to take 2 minutes now, and I'd like you to think about what we just talked about for the first 20 minutes of class. And I'd like you just to summarize what you think the main points are from the first 20 minutes of the course. And turn to your neighbors and discuss this, and then write down what you think they are. You don't have to do any preparation for something like that. You just create a gap of a couple of minutes every so often in the lecture. You may only do it twice. You might do it 3 times if you have a longer lecture. And the students immediately get a chance to think about what was just discussed. And a lot of the research in education is very clear on this. Simply that opportunity to retrieve or to think about what was just discussed, to reflect on what was just discussed, has a big role to play in helping students learn and retain information. If that's practice, if formative assessment is the practice, then the summative assessment is the result. It's the big game. And so this can come in a variety of ways. The classics are the homeworks, the quizzes, online quizzes. You could write essays. It could be midterm exams. It could be a lot of things. Sorry, moved along a little quickly there. And so this typically is where a lot of the grade comes in, and this is also where a lot of anxiety and stress comes in for students. So thinking about what these things should look like, the goals should be to marry these back to the learning goals. If you've given them learning goals, you should see those learning goals reflected in the questions you're asking. If they're not, then you're essentially teaching one thing and asking about a different thing. So if you're focusing on the learning goals, the exam should reflect those learning goals as closely as possible. And so one way to do this is simply to say, this is what, I'm going to write an exam based on learning goals. Another thing is to use this opportunity to kind of set some standards and to give students some gauge as to what you're looking for. And I'm not talking about multiple choice questions here. I'm thinking more about an essay question that might be a little longer. It might be a page or two, or a diagram that you might want to draw. And so giving them some idea as to what a good answer looks like is a great way to make sure that they work to a higher level. So it could be you might give them practice exams to play with, to think about the style of question. You might give them sample questions ahead of time and say you're going to pick a certain number of those. You might give them a rubric to work on. You might say, okay, I'm going to give you an essay, and this is what I'm looking for in a good essay answer. And at the face of it, you might think, well, I'm just telling them the answer then, aren't I? But no, what that really means is you're telling them what you're looking for in a good answer. So here's a simple rubric that Diane Ebert-May, a biologist at Michigan State, uses. She has a number of other rubrics at this address that you can go and look at. And basically, essentially, you say, this is what I'm going to grade on. And so nothing in here talks about the content and the student understanding or the concepts. It talks simply about how the responses, the essays, will be created and generated and written and presented. And so if these factors are included, then the students get a clear view of what it is you're looking for. Because if you're asking them to write something, chances are they don't have a lot of experience in that, especially in the earlier courses. And so they need more guidance than you might expect on this. Giving this rubric helps them get a sense of what you're looking for, minimizes their anxiety, helps guide them to create a better product. At the end, if you give them the rubric before they do the answer, before they write their answers, then you're going to be much happier with the result than if you don't give them the rubric ahead of time. And so once the assessment's done, then you get some feedback, and the ideal kind of feedback is based on this kind of fidelity model. That is, it should be frequent, and that is lots of feedback as much as possible. So every day in lecture, you should be giving them some kind of feedback on what your learning goals are for that day, based on the experiences they're going through. It should be as soon as possible. So you give them an exam, give them feedback for the next week. Don't wait another month until before the next exam to give them response in the first one. It should be clear in what good work looks like versus poor work looks like. And so that's the beauty of the rubric. It makes that very clear. This is what a high grade should be. This is what a low grade looks like. And finally, remember what it's like to be given bad news. So be empathetic. Don't, it's a lot of students struggle in school, especially on that first exam when they're trying to gauge exactly what it is you're looking for. If the guidelines aren't explicit to them, they'll often kind of default to whatever their other experiences have been. And so, give them opportunities along the way to kind of step up and make corrections. You might think about giving a first exam that doesn't count for as many points, or give them some opportunities to redo some questions that they do particularly poorly on. But setting a bar and helping them kind of get there, and being empathetic if they don't do well, that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to give them a good grade for doing badly. It just means that you can be understanding and reassuring that there are other opportunities that are going to come along. So at this point, I would like you to kind of come up with some kind of assessment of your learning goal. I would like that, but I don't really have time for that. So think of it as you've got a learning goal. How would you assess that now? And just based on what a lot of you said before, you could come up with a simple conceptual multiple choice question. You might ask them to write a short essay. You might ask them to draw something or a labeled sketch, something like that. There are lots of opportunities in there that you could pause and just ask that to happen, ask them to do that in class as you move along. So I'm conscious of the time, and I don't want to take too much longer, so I want to get to the last point, which is the teaching and learning activity. So by now, you've created some learning goals, and for each learning goal, you've tied a piece of feedback and assessment. It doesn't have to be comprehensive, but something that allows you to ask them a question to get at that learning goal so they can kind of match it up. Maybe you don't do all the learning goals in class each day. Maybe some of them are online quizzes, or maybe some of them are homeworks the students are doing on their own time. But you want to see if you can at least give them a chance to assess each learning goal as much as possible along the way. So let's say you've got your learning goals, you've got an idea of what you're going to ask them to do to assess those learning goals and give them feedback. So then how do you go about teaching the material? The classic default situation is that you get up and you lecture, you talk for 50 minutes. But as we just talked about, you're trying to get the feedback in there, you're trying to get assessment in there. So 50-minute long performance from you doesn't really help us that much. So what is it that helps students learn in class? Well, the research is pretty clear on this. There's lots of things it tells us, but if you boil it down, here's 3 little nuggets that I like to emphasize, and others might pick different things, but we all kind of come back to the same general trends. First of all, and this kind of goes back to the formative assessment, students need to monitor their learning. They have to think about the learning as they're doing it. If they wait a few weeks before as they get ready for the exam, it's too late. They've forgotten all the details. They'll get confused about stuff. They have no way to kind of catch up all that stuff at once. So giving them a chance to monitor their learning as it's going on through these formative assessment techniques helps immeasurably. Ask them the questions that go beyond simple memory. It's not just enough to remember the term, the jargon, the definition of something. Instead, ask them to apply it to a new situation. Ask them to transfer that learning. In other words, if they learn what one plate boundary looks like and what the configuration of earthquakes and volcanoes might be in that setting, give them a different plate configuration and ask them to identify where the volcanoes and earthquakes would be in that setting. What type of magma they might see generated, what direction the plates are moving. Even asking them how many plates are in the figure is often an interesting challenge for students the first time around. So simply changing things around and asking them to do things and scaffold that learning. So we emphasize here the use of higher order thinking skills. So start off low and slowly build up with time. And so, initially it might simply be, where is the volcano in this diagram? Where would you put a volcano in this diagram? How many plates are in this figure? Then it might be draw a cross section. Then it might be here's the description, draw a map and cross section representing this. Or then it might be how to interpret this map you've never seen before and tell me what plate tectonic processes are happening there. So you can kind of build up to these things, but you have to kind of step up and allow students to build on their knowledge as they go, and not just jump in at the high end. But set that bar, and don't just accept memorization. And finally, a key part of all this is that knowledge is socially constructed, and it's a lot of you listening to this, you're strong learners, you're bright people, you can learn things on your own, and you did well because you can learn things on your own. But for many of our students, they're good at that in certain settings, but in many settings they need that social interaction to help. You need to explain your ideas to someone else to ensure that to see if they understand it. If you can explain to somebody else, then you feel you understand it. If you get feedback from them on what you just said, you can listen to them and measure what they're saying and see if you understand what they're telling you. That helps validate what you've learned and see if you've understood it. Also, it's just more interesting. It's more fun to talk to other people and to sit there and stare straight ahead for 50 minutes and write stuff down in your notebook. So any combination of things like this that you can do in one class are going to help learning. So the idea of a learner-centered class is one that's broken into short segments divided by assessments. Students get to work together in groups, and they're given a variety of formative assessments, formative exercises that help measure their progress towards understanding of the information and towards the learning goals that you've set. So earlier I mentioned the idea of just pausing your lecture for a couple of minutes. So just to show the significance of this, and this is actually a very old study, but nonetheless, still a valid study. So one instructor paused for 2 minutes 3 times in the lecture. So you can imagine dividing your lecture into 3 parts. After each part, you stop for 2 minutes, and you say, okay, discuss what we just talked about. What are the main points? Write those down. Students take 2 minutes, they do that. The rest of the time in the control group, the instructor just lectures away. 12 days later, students come back, they take a delayed multiple choice test. Both groups do the same test. The experimental group does about a letter grade better than the control group, simply because they took a little time during class to think about what it was they were trying to learn. And the students did something. The students were active in the class. So this kind of thing has been done in a variety of ways. People have used a variety of different techniques and allowed students to do a lot of different things. Active learning, that student activity in class can look a lot of different ways depending upon what your needs are, what your interests are, and where you are most comfortable. You can have lots of small group discussion. You can do the think, pair, share thing for put people in twos. You can use clickers. You can have some kind of role playing, typically in a smaller class. Jigsaw exercises, which I will direct you back to the CERC site for those. Those are great ways to give individual students responsibility for some of the lesson, and they essentially teach each other what their components are, and then they all have to kind of put the information together. You can show them images and have them interpret what those mean. So a lot of these things, they're great for small groups or for pairs or even for students to work on as individuals. But a big thing we would encourage here is the collaborative efforts, whether it's in students in 2s and 3s and 4s, small group settings, discussing ideas and answering questions together in class. So you've got your learning goals tied to assessments, which then link to these different teaching and learning activities that are going on in class, setting up these small group activities to tie back into the learning activities and the student group work. So I'll stop it here. So we have time for some questions. I'll leave you this summary slide. So, I can't really emphasize this enough, but let me just leave you with one example because you can read this stuff as I talk. We've done many workshops of professional development where faculty get together for several days, and we go over this material, and they learn it, and they get excited, and everybody's really pumped, and they all go back to their respective institutions, and they get busy, and it's hard to implement this when you're away from kind of the source in which you find it. And there's lots of research on professional development that shows that that's a tough thing to do. And especially the research institution where people have a lot of emphasis on doing things other than teaching. It's a challenge to kind of incorporate these things into classes. So this semester, one of my grad students is sitting in on a course, on a minerals course, and she's taken the course before herself, but the instructor is interested in modifying some of the things he does. He's not happy with the, there's a lot of information, and students struggle with it, and so he's trying to figure out what he can do. So she's been sitting in the course, and she said, well, how about I put up some learning objectives for your class at the beginning of every lecture. So she goes in at the beginning of class and she writes the learning objectives on the board. And initially she would write them on the board, and they would be there, and he would kind of rattle through his lecture, and that would be it. He would rarely refer to them, but students at least had a little signpost. And then we talked to him and said, well, these learning objectives, you could consider stopping when you get to each one, and going to say, giving the students a chance to maybe ask a question, or asking the students a question about each one. And so he went from this guy who just went in and showed a bunch of slides and just blitzed through the whole thing and just left students confused and dazed. Someone who goes in and he puts the learning objectives go up, and he gets to each one, he stops and he pauses and he asks a couple of questions, and then he picks it up and he goes off again, and he goes on. And this has all happened in the course of like 3 weeks at the beginning of the semester. He's completely transformed his lectures simply because he puts up learning objectives, and then he pauses for a brief time when he gets to each one and asks them to make sure the students are understanding what the key ingredients are in the lecture. Simplest of changes, doesn't require a massive amount of effort, but the students are more engaged, he's more interactive with the students, and now there's a way to measure if learning is happening as the class is going along. So we're happy to take some questions. If you have any, if you want to type them in the little chat boxes, Andy can relay them to me, and I'll happy to answer anything for folks. At the same time, we understand that some of you may have other responsibilities that require you to be elsewhere. So thank you very much for your participation in this. It's always a lot of fun to do these things. So I hope this has been some help to you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right, thanks very much, David. I do have a couple questions here. There's one from Danielle Sumi.
Okay.
How do you begin to figure out whether your students need more concrete versus abstract examples? Or should you saturate your course with both to meet both needs?
Well, I think students need both concrete and abstract examples, because I usually try to have, let's say, simpler, more concrete examples at the start of a concept, and things get progressively more abstract, shall we say, as I see them developing their learning. So we usually try to keep the first few formative assessment examples relatively straightforward and simple, and then gradually make them a little more sophisticated and a little more abstract as we go along. But you just put in the mix. Sometimes there are some things it's easier to do than others. Some concepts just naturally lend themselves to lots of concrete analogies, and others, unfortunately, are just tougher to do that. But a big part of it is just trying to measure that sense of understanding, or I shouldn't say understanding, sense of learning that the students have got by asking simple multiple choice questions. I use a lot of clicker questions. I like to bring those into class, and usually we start off with some students off. We also require them to do some reading before they come to class, and they have to complete an online exercise by 2 a.m. the night before class, and then we review those before they come to class, and that gives us a sense of what they know and where they are, and we base our first few questions on that work they do before class, and then we build off that from there. A big part of, I don't really have time to talk about today, but one of my core beliefs is that students have to do work outside class, and it's not all on us to teach them everything. That by identifying the simpler stuff that they can do on their own, that frees me from having to talk about that class, and so I can spend more time focusing on the more challenging things. Thanks, Danielle. That's a good question.
Oh yeah, no problem. Here's one from Katie Kiernan. What is an effective method to evaluate at the beginning of a semester the level of the students coming into the class to determine where the class should start? Each year, my students come in with different background levels, geology, math, tectonic basics, even if they have the same background requirements. And she adds, it makes the first few weeks a challenge as she figures that out.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. I used to teach an upper level course in my last institution, and they all had to take the same intro course, and I would ask them some questions from that intro course, um, and I was always amazed at how much they'd forgotten just in a few couple of years, and these were majors, and so trying to figure out where people are coming into a course where they may or may not have had the same preparation courses, may have a different instructors, may have taken them at different institutions, is a real challenge. The 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 simplest answer to that is you give them some kind of pretest. Identify, what is it that is essential to you for them to know ahead of time, and then figure out if they know it or not. Now, if they don't know it, then what do you do? So one of the challenges then becomes, well, how do you make that up? And there may be places along the way that you just kind of accept that some students are going to not have as much background, and so their answers are not going to be as good, or they may be more challenged. Or you can go at it the other way and say, well, you're responsible for knowing this. This is the prerequisite for the course. If you're a little weak on it, go here and make sure you read up on it before this particular part of class. And certainly with the beauty of online materials are available through Google and everywhere else these days, is that there's typically no end of resources out there. And if you can identify a few good places for people to do some background work if they're weak in a couple of areas, that's, you can put it on them to catch that up. So my answer is we do pre-tests. We also ask them questions about how many people have taken science classes before and which science classes they've taken. And we've tried it in different ways. In some semesters, we've actually grouped people based on the amount of prior experience they've had. So you could seat people in groups with students with more skills mixed in with students with less skills, and that way essentially you're evening out the class, and you're having, if you like to think of it as class experts, mixed in amongst the rest of the group, so that there's always somebody nearby who knows something about that topic. On the other hand, one of the things about having a diverse class with people coming from a variety of backgrounds is that they do have a lot of different experiences to draw from that help then inform with examples and analogies in class that you would not get if everybody had the same background. So there are some powers to it. It's just a matter of trying to balance everything.
Okay.
Thanks, Katie.
I have another question here from Anna Cordier, and she asks, it starts with a comment and I think turns into a question. One of the issues I run into with inserting time for practice examples into a class, especially a larger one, is that it is difficult to balance the amount of time to give to the students. There are always some students who finish quickly and are sitting around, and other students who don't complete the few sample questions I give. I have dealt with this by immediately providing a key online for self-check, but some students are always frustrated. Any suggestions for achieving a better balance?
Well, so this is always a challenge. I think, and especially when I started doing this, I was always frustrated by the fact that there is going to be some range in how students respond to these kinds of things. Some students love the interactivity. Some students just want you to teach them everything, so they don't have to do anything. They sit there and absorb it like a sponge. And then there are those who finish faster and others that don't. So I find in the groups that kind of that helps sort that out, because when they're in a group, if they get done more quickly, they're still they're in a group. There's other people to talk to, and they tend to talk about other things. And as long as they're not distracting and aren't making a lot of noise any more than anybody else, then if it's another minute or two, then it doesn't make a big difference. To be honest, I rarely run into a situation where I have big lags of time with some groups finishing way ahead of the others. So in my experience in the lecture, at least, that's not as big an issue. It certainly is more of an issue in the lab. And so what we try to do in lab settings is we try to mix up exercises where students are working in small group scenarios with 3 or 4 others, and they're completing the work in that group scenario. And then every so often we'll bring it together as a whole class group, where we'll say, okay, we're going to come back and we're going to answer this question, and I want you all to respond to that. And so in that kind of scenario, then each group would be responding to something and be completing that task, and they might do that at different rates. But then we would have a second task which everybody was going to respond to when all the groups had finished. And in that situation, that's the groups who finish first can be better prepared to respond to the other question. So essentially, they have something else they can be working on, and it sounds kind of like you're doing some of that already. Um, but at the end of the day, I think the thing to remember with any of this stuff is that there's no panacea here. There's no kind of perfect solution. That if you can get the majority of the students working online, working actively and being engaged in the material, there may be a few that finish ahead of time and stare at the ceiling and get a little too fussy with it. But if I'd rather a few people wait and have more people finish, but I don't necessarily need everybody to be finished. So I don't mind stopping it a little earlier, especially if it's a formative assessment piece, because again, no grade attached to it. It's just something you're doing, to kind of measure learning. And if it's, especially if it's formative, you can say, well, okay, if you didn't quite finish it, then don't forget to read that up later on your own, and move on from there. And if you can get them to do a little prep before they come to class too, that can help move things along, because then they kind of know what's coming, and there's not as much time trying to figure out exactly what's happening. Sometimes the issue with timing is that they simply don't know what it is they're supposed to do, and so especially in a longer, more sophisticated exercise, I might break it up into smaller parts, so it's more digestible chunks, so they know exactly what each step looks like, and they do that step, and then we go to the next step, and that tends to keep the groups closer together, rather than having a big 10, 15-minute thing where I don't do anything. Then I find people tend to get lost and miss details. So taking it in smaller bites helps me avoid some of that issue too. But thanks for that question.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any more questions, but I do see a lot of people thanking you and a lot of positive comments about the webinar. And I just wanted to add to that. I think that this was great and it was really useful. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to deliver the webinar today.
Not at all. I'm happy to do it. And if anyone has questions and they just want to email me independently, I'd be happy to try to respond to those as well. So and I would put another plug in for the Cirque site. If you've not gone there yet, it's just an amazing treasure trove of stuff on almost any aspect of the geosciences. It can be helpful in so many different ways. So if you haven't gone to cirque.carleton.edu, I recommend it very highly.
I think that
But
would be
thanks
a good.
very much for your participation.
I think that would be a good website to link off of our early career page as well. So we'll definitely do that. That would be a great resource.
Excellent.
Yeah. No, our pleasure. Well, I just, yeah, let's everybody, I can't unmute everybody, but I'm sure people are clapping for you in their offices around the country. But yeah, thank you very much, David, again, for a great lecture. And I just wanted to remind everybody who's still out there that this was recorded and it'll be posted on the Early Career Investigators page. I'm actually going to change the presenter over to me real quick just to show my screen. Let's see, show my screen right here. So what you can see is it's on this iris.edu/HQ/ECI. And actually, on the tab that says upcoming over here, we have the current webinar listed. So I'll replace that with a link to the YouTube video once it's uploaded. So just stay tuned for that. And again, thanks everybody for coming out, and thank you, David, for your lecture. And enjoy the rest of your afternoons.